Hi, everybody. Welcome. This is the Rotary E-Club of Silicon Valley, and every week we bring you stories of people who are innovatively making a difference in the lives of others, locally, globally, and digitally. The Rotary E-Club of Silicon Valley, which you can find at rotary.cool, yes, that works, is part of Rotary International, 1.4 million Rotarians and Rotaractors around the world who are doing all kinds of cool things in their communities. And if you're kind of in that space of like, wow, I'd like to be part of an interesting group of people that makes great things happen in their community, then take a look at rotary.org or just come and see us, rotary.cool. So with that, let's get to the program that we have recorded for you this week, which of course is an interesting function of how you think about time, since we're about to record it as I speak, but nevertheless. I was very lucky to read a piece about Sharon Terry. She is a person with a message about something that often people aren't thinking that much about. But once she begins to describe it to you, it becomes obvious this is a really important issue we've got. It has to do with genomic medicine. And she will tell you the full story, but I will add this before handing the mic over to her, that our president, Angelica, has made it a goal this year for us to be able to highlight all sorts of interesting things related to health. And we have got a good one for you today. So with that, Sharon, I'm going to hand it over to you. And when you hand it over to Ryan, I'll have you introduce him as well. All of our viewers, if you would like to see the full bio, feel free to pause the video. If you are on the YouTube page, scroll down and see that. Or if you are on our meeting page, pause and scroll back up and you can see what is printed there. Sharon, without any more ado in terms of like my rambling, thank you so much for taking time to be with us, you and Ryan both, and I hand the mic over to you.
Great. Thanks very much, Rustin. Really, really good to be with you and Shags as well, and others who will be viewing this as we do this kind of future and past transition. I'm Sharon Terry, and I'm president and CEO of Genetic Alliance, which is a coalition of patient advocacy groups and others who are working to transform research and services and bring it to people. And today I wanted to share with you a very important program to us, and one that I think you'll understand is really critical actually to the whole globe, which might sound a little over ambitious, but I think once you see what we have here, you will hopefully agree with us. And so introducing you to iHope Genetic Health. I'm starting this presentation with my two kids, which might seem a little schlocky or pedantic, depending on your view, but my two kids were diagnosed with a rare genetic condition in 1994 after a diagnostic odyssey. Now, that's not a fun trip. It's actually a very difficult time in a family's life. Maybe some of you have experienced this, where you, your kids, your spouse, your parents have gone through a time where no one knew what condition they had, but they had symptoms. And so my two kids had a number of symptoms, and we were trying to figure out what they were. And so when they were 5 and 7, they were diagnosed with a rare disease called pseudoxanthoma elasticum. And that story is interesting. You can look at my TED Talk or website, pxe.org, if you want to hear more about it. But I want to talk to you about a program that prevents this kind of suffering on top of suffering. It's bad enough to have a genetic disease or any disease, but to go through this diagnostic odyssey, this time of uncertainty, is really terrible for families. There are about 250 million people with a genetic disease worldwide. And just to put that in some kind of perspective, there are 212 malaria cases. There are 212 million malaria cases, 40 million people living with HIV. And so it's a problem of enormous magnitude, and one that becomes really much more critical as we deal with infectious disease and HIV, but don't seem to be willing to step up to deal with genetic disease. Worldwide, these 250 people have families and societies and communities, and here's a picture of just a few people around the world who are undiagnosed. Our program, iHope Genetic Health, focuses on low to middle income countries and low to moderate income communities and households in the developed world. So people who cannot get access to services, let alone important genomic technology that actually can make a big difference. And so when you see these faces, what they call to me anyway about is, if we can just bring what we now consider kind of bread and butter genomic technologies like genome sequencing to these families, to these communities, these kids get diagnosed before they need a walker, before they need some assistive device, before they die. And we're really trying to shorten that odyssey, get to them when they first have symptoms, and give them this relatively inexpensive technology to do the kinds of diagnosing and then eventually leading to treatment that we want to see. And so our vision is that every individual, regardless of race, ethnicity, or geographic location, receive a diagnosis, is connected to appropriate care and research, because we're not going to just leave them, yay, we named your disease, but instead, how do they get the care they need and control their own genomic health data. This part's important too, because right now we see in the world is a lot of genomic data being aggregated, and it's pretty much locked up. And so we want to put that control where it belongs, in the hands of those individuals. Brian, my colleague, is going to talk to you in a few minutes about a couple of these cases in some specifics. Suffice it to say that he actually has piloted this program before Genetic Alliance launched it in more than 1,000 individuals around the globe with many partners, because we don't want to do this as either us, US Americans, helicoptering in. We really want to partner with people on the ground where they live, where they eat, work, play, and pray, so that these programs can bring capacity to these countries and capacity to these communities. Our goal is to scale to 50,000 kids, adults, mostly children, per year within the next 5 years. And this might sound crazily ambitious when you think about the first genome costing $1 billion, and in the last 10 years going from 1 million down to now in the hundreds of dollars. Even still, 50,000 at that cost would be outrageous. And we have now the technology as well as the partners who are willing to help us do that. A genetic diagnosis really makes a difference because it stops the diagnostic odyssey, as I said. It reduces the psychological suffering of not knowing, connects the patients and the clinicians to a community. Once you're diagnosed, you can be with others who are like you, and that's really important. Establishes the foundation for precision care. You've heard of precision medicine, maybe, genomic medicine. All of those things are really awesome, and we need to get to the place where the rubber hits the road and we're implementing these amazing innovations. And it creates a resource for further research, which is really a critical piece too. So how are we going to do this? We actually have an incredible donation from Illumina, the sequencing company, for $120 million in kind, in instruments, those are the machines that do the sequencing, and reagents, those are the chemicals that are used. AWS, Amazon Web Services, has given us pretty much unlimited storage for this very important health equity program. And Luna has given us a platform to allow individuals to control their data. And essentially, Genetic Alliance has worked across the globe to connect to labs that are capable of doing this, to be able to deliver this technology to them. The labs are working with clinics. We're providing some clinical support to those labs, and those are connecting to patients. Those patients then are connected through the platform to both the treatments that exist and, where there's no treatment, to clinical research in a way that is unprecedented across the globe. I'm going to turn this over to Ryan now. Ryan is VP of Scientific Research at Illumina, and he's been the guy on the ground doing this work over the last quite a few years. So Ryan, I'm turning it over to you.
Yeah, thanks, Sharon. So I might just briefly start with my origin story, like Sharon started with hers. So about 12 years ago, I was a pretty boring academic working on gene regulatory networks and how they evolve over time. And I got a phone call from a father who had a child who was about a year of age. They had been on vacation, actually in Fiji. They had flown back, and on the flight back, his child started acting erratically. He couldn't get him under control. He was screaming. They went straight to the ER to try and help their son. They spent the next 12 hours in the ER. And eventually the clinicians came out and said, your child has a leukodystrophy. Now, like many of you here, you'll have no idea what that word meant. Neither did he. He eventually found out it meant that there was something wrong in the central nervous system of his son. And then he did something that I think is truly unprecedented at the time. He reached out all over the world because the clinicians had told him it was highly likely that this disease was genetic in origin. And so he was like, well, what can I do to try and figure out this mystery? And he convinced the company I now work for to actually sequence his son's genome, and then went around the world shopping for people who would analyze that data. We ended up on a phone call by sheer happenstance. I was just going to give him some advice. My background's in genomics and computational biology. Here's how I would tackle the problem if I were you. He was intent that I was going to solve the problem for him. So he won in that dialogue. And making a very long story short, we were able to not just sequence mom and dad, sequence this man, Stephen, and his wife, but figure out what was wrong with this little boy. We discovered a new human disease in the process, and that little boy's life and mine changed almost overnight. And so I left academia, came to biotech to try and make this technology, whole genome sequencing, available to every kid on the planet who needs it. And as Sharon mentioned, we've run this program as kind of a pilot over the last almost 10 years now, trying to give clinical whole genome sequencing. So we're going to sequence every letter of these patients' genome to try and get them a diagnosis, to try and stop the diagnostic odyssey as quickly as possible, and to get them the treatment they need. Sharon mentioned the 1,000 patients that we've now kind of really systematically looked at. We've been able to diagnose more than 40% of those patients, keeping in mind that most of those patients would have never received a diagnosis. And nearly 70% of the patients who participate in the program have a change in clinical management as a result of the information that they receive from us. So one of the reasons we are excited, enthusiastic, passionate, feel like we have a moral imperative to spread what we've been doing is because we know it works, and it works globally. So to give you a couple of stories to kind of really bring this home, this is just a placeholder. We have several clinical sites in Peru. And I want to tell you a story about a boy who was on a 14-year diagnostic odyssey. His name was Sebastian. His name is Sebastian. We just had the fortune to speak with his parents and the clinician that supported them a couple of weeks ago. And as usual, the story was overpowering. Most of us were crying by the end of the call. Sebastian had been born normally. He was a healthy, happy little boy. At about 25 days of age, he started acting erratically. He then developed epilepsy, and mom and dad in this resource-limited setting in Peru start hunting around like any parents, trying to figure out what's wrong with their child, seeing specialist after specialist, Googling, making phone calls, and no one was able to figure out what was wrong with this boy. So they ended up on this 14-year diagnostic odyssey. We had partnered with a clinic in Peru. Dr. Duenas had suggested to the family they might want to participate in iHope and see if this helped them. We ran this little boy's genome and we found a precision diagnosis. So he has a mutation in a gene called SLC2A1, which is diagnostic for GLUT1 deficiency. Now, all that jargon doesn't mean much, or it's very complicated. But what it points to is a very specific diagnosis with a very specific therapy. So what this little boy needed was a change in his diet and nothing more. He needed to be put on a ketogenic diet. They couldn't even think about doing that or know to do that without that precision diagnosis. So when he was put on the ketogenic diet, his epilepsy came under almost complete control. His behavioral issues have stopped, and the quality of life of that family has improved dramatically, which led to them being very emotional on the phone call, talking about the impact of a diagnosis. But before we go to the next slide, Sharon, the world we want to live in, though, is where that little boy doesn't have to wait 14 years for a diagnosis, where he gets it as soon as there's any indication of a genetic disease, because if he had been put on a ketogenic diet at 25 days of age, as opposed to 14 years of age, we would have prevented the intellectual disability that he's now saddled with for the rest of his life. So a diagnosis mattered to this child. It would have mattered even more to get it to him sooner. Next slide, please, Sharon. And I'm delighted to talk about this next example. So that was from a low and middle income country where we've seen hundreds and hundreds of cases where we've led to changes in management. This is one from Anchorage, Alaska. So on the left of your screen, you're looking at Debbie. On the right of your screen, you're looking at Delaney. These two women came into the program through a very strange set of circumstances. There was a TV show that lasted one season, produced by Ann Curry. It was called Chasing the Cure. We got in touch with them because as we saw this TV show come on to our screens, we realized that a lot of these patients could potentially benefit from whole genome sequencing. And so we did whole genome sequencing on this family. They had been more than 30 years without a diagnosis. What we found is that they had mutations in a gene called DDR2. And the reason that was important is it's recurrently mutated in cancer. We were able to pull a chemotherapeutic off the shelf and give it to both of these women. They were having trouble with movement, with peripheral neuropathy. And the biggest thing was Delaney, the woman on the right there, the daughter of Debbie, had become legally blind. And within 6 months of going on this therapy, she literally was able to remove the scales from her eyes. Skin had grown over her eyes. She was able to see. She went back to school, and a painting that she did not long afterwards hangs over my desk at home. So these are tremendous outcomes from just providing these patients with the diagnosis that they need.
Thanks very much, Ryan. Wrapping us up, one of the other really big benefits, in addition to, you can imagine, 250 million stories like this, is that we will be and are breaking data silos down. Right now, the data, when it's found, is controlled by either universities or companies. And all of this data is controlled by the people in a platform that allows them to share their data and create a whole new ecosystem in biomedical research and in biotechnology. So this part, while I'm going over it very fast, is massive and really important to the future. So as I said, Illumina's given us 120 million in kind over 5 years of reagents and sequencers, cloud storage from AWS. Luna's given us the patient-centered data. And we're in the process of raising $5 million over the next 1.5 years, 60 million over the next 5 years for all of the last mile, all of the infrastructure to ship the reagents, to partner with these countries and to do the kinds of operations that we need. And so we're very, very happy to share this with you, not only because we welcome your donations, of course, you can visit us at iHopegenetichealth.org, but also because you're sharing these stories, this video will really make a difference in the lives of many, many people. Thank you.
All right, Sharon. Wow. You and Ryan have shared such a an emotionally powerful kind of message here as well. I'm so impressed. Thank you. Go ahead and stop sharing your screen, and let's kind of jump into our questions. Let me introduce who we have. In addition to having met Sharon and Ryan, we have from our club the Paella Master, Sharon. Thank you. And my name is Rushton. I am the programs chair for our little online and asynchronous club. Let's start with the idea of genome sequencing period. What is involved for the patient in a genome sequence? Like, is it just a sample of blood? But what are we talking about, and what kind of time and things like that?
Give that to you, Ryan.
Yeah, that is my wheelhouse. Yeah, the technology's come a very long way in a very short time. So the simple answer is, yeah, it's just a blood draw. Standard purple top tube, just like you get whenever you go to the doctor for your physical. Comes to the lab, the DNA is extracted from the blood, it gets prepared, it goes on the sequencing machine. That takes 2 to 3 days, and it can take another couple of weeks to analyze it. And so the turnaround time tends to be 2 to 4 weeks for one of these tests.
And does that involve a communication of data to a central source, or is it that at every site? So, for example, you talked about the Chilean boy who's with a ketogenic diet, is suddenly okay, right? Yeah. Or okay to the extent that one can be based on 14 years worth of dealing with the challenge. Yeah. But is that something where what the Genetic Alliance is doing is seeking to have everything locally available, or once the sequence happens, does it come to here and that info is then sent right back? How does that work? So you're muted.
Yes, sorry. We have to say that in a Zoom, right? So both, really. We are really interested in enabling various communities. Ryan's worked in Ghana, DR Congo, Peru, obviously. We've talked to folks in India. There's quite a number of other African countries that are interested, and basically building the infrastructure there. So the sequencing would be done in country. The results would be analyzed in country, and the interpretation would be in country, with the support of lots and lots of volunteers that have come forward in a really beautiful way who want to help here. The data then is both given to the laboratory, given to the clinician in the sense of the report, but then the laboratories will be transmitting the genome, and these genomes are large files of raw data back to Luna, the platform. And Luna lives in the cloud. So the cloud, AWS, is wonderful in that it could be in any country, anywhere, and the individual controls access to that. So the individual will consent to having further research done or decide not to until later or whatever they want to do. But basically what it builds is the world's largest genomic data resource that's a stream, because we keep in touch with all these folks. Did you get the care you needed? Do you want to be part of the next clinical trial? Should we set up a clinical trial somewhere? We're doing all that work. And meanwhile, these data then are living, breathing data so that any researcher from anywhere can come in and analyze these data for all the people who have said yes to that. The genomes we have currently, and Ryan's better at explaining this than me, are mostly Western Europeans. And so when it comes to African genomes, Asian genomes, we're working in Southeast Asia also, there's not much available in terms of having references for those folks so that when they're diagnosed, they can compare it to a genome like them.
So that actually just slotted something together in my head. When we first began communicating about having you make the presentation, and you told me a little of the story, you talked about how you're once there was a diagnosis, a company had contacted you and said, "Hey, can we get a blood sample of your children?" And you said, "Well, sure. I mean, if this is going to help others, then fantastic." And they show up and they take a blood sample and they leave, and then like within days or something, you get another call. And they essentially want the same thing, and you're saying, "We just did this," and they're like, "We're all separate folks." In that you are seeking to do this at the scale you are, that means that the data that individual companies would be going after suddenly becomes this kind of open resource. How does that allow? So there's a savings to companies that would be interested in the data. Is that a part of the argument for creating partnerships to help support the operations of your organization?
Yeah, absolutely, Rushton. You nailed it there. And I want to point out, we're talking about companies, but also academic groups. So for my kids, 2 days before Christmas, they're diagnosed. 2 days after Christmas, it's an academic lab in New York that comes and takes their blood. And then 3 days after that, it's a Boston lab, academic, that comes and says, I need their blood. And when they say to me, we don't share, and they laugh, I'm astounded as a parent of 2 small children that you are not going to take blood again from 2 little kids just because you don't share. And I have a saying in my TED talk that you can herd cats if you move the food. And I realize the food really is that people have the power to aggregate their bio specimens, their data, and then everybody come to the same milk bowl and have it be open. Then in fact, yes, cooperation, collaboration is the name of the game. And it makes tons of sense for companies across the board to support this project because everybody benefits, no matter what their interest, no matter what their pipeline, and the same for academic researchers to have this resource at their fingertips without paying for going to somebody's house and getting the blood. All that is quite amazing.
So, Ryan, I assume that this is something that's kind of clear to you and the team at Illumina. Can you speak a little bit to the partnership possibilities that are represented by what I will characterize as this very bold vision on the part of Genetic Alliance?
Oh, well, let's go back to first principles. We want to live in a world where every patient on the face of the planet who needs a diagnosis can get one. And so when we think about the deployment of the technology, actually, the figure you have behind you of the Rotary Club and its connections is exactly what we're talking about here. So we're talking about dozens of laboratories all over the world providing philanthropic clinical whole genome sequencing to these patients in need and creating a way to centralize that data so that it can be accessed by academics, nonprofits, and for-profit institutions to understand these disorders, right? We need natural history information. We need to actually understand how they develop. We want to be able to get rid of the N of 1 problem. So we find these patients where we find something nasty, but we don't have another patient that looks like them in the world. And so by breaking down these silos, we solve that problem. And then we talk about the ability to develop actual new therapeutics. And so I think this program it starts the boulder rolling down the other side of the hill, right? We've been climbing up that hill for a long time with the boulder, trying to get the technology where it needs to go, the informational infrastructure, make sure we have standards in place. It's all there. This isn't research anymore. This is clinical implementation. Let's build the bowl that's going to hold the milk and bring everybody there.
So I'm struck by the fact that as a club, we're very interested in innovative stories of community benefit of one kind or another, right? And that there is a special place in our hearts for the sustainability element of such a thing. It would seem to me that your partners, in seeing the value of the shared information, might also value helping you with the operational costs of doing something like this. Now, that's I don't mean to put Illumina on the spot for this. You guys have already put in $120 million worth of equipment. But can you speak maybe to the challenges of doing something that a lot of organizations have trouble with? We have this vision. It's a compelling vision. People like the vision, but we need to make it work, and we need to make it work by being able to have a team that can communicate with people and move equipment around the world and things like that.
Yeah, I'll start, and then Ryan, you can jump in. So absolutely, Rushton, we are in a really interesting place because in addition to trying to diagnose the world's undiagnosed and share the data broadly, we're actually also building an ecosystem, a philanthropic ecosystem in a place that nobody's done it before, which is inherited disease writ large. Because everybody will give money to the Alzheimer's Association or to the Cystic Fibrosis Foundation or to their favorite project in a lab or a pipeline in a company, but they don't want to give it because this is so broad. And what we're arguing is that if we can accelerate this kind of aggregation this fast, then everybody wins. We all get to play. And it becomes actually what we've all read about in sociology class of the problem of the commons, that nobody wants to mow the lawn or fix the fence, but everybody wants their kids to play there and their dogs to romp. And so we are in a position where, very much like Gates 16, 17 years ago, because I've talked extensively to them, where they built an ecosystem for infectious disease writ large. It doesn't matter what infectious disease you have, they're there. And we are building it in inherited disease. And so you're right, and we're just waiting for partners who get it like this, in fact, the way you get it, to join us to say, this really makes a lot of sense and it really helps to float all boats. Ryan, anything you want to add to that?
No, I think that was a perfect answer.
I might add, I've been through genetic testing because my mother developed ovarian cancer and her sister died of it, probably because their parents were first cousins. And my sisters and I all tested for the BRCA gene, BRCA2. I was negative, so I'm not a carrier. My daughters are safe. My younger sister wasn't a carrier. My older sister was, and she had an oophorectomy just for precaution.
Mm-hmm.
So
Yeah. It's
maybe hopefully that will have prolonged anything or eliminated any problems.
Absolutely. And Shags, you bring up an important point too, because while we're going for diagnosing the undiagnosed, in almost all cases, we have at least one parent. We try to have two parents called trios. And all of the parents have cancer, diabetes, Alzheimer's, Parkinson's. And again, this database will have all of these individuals making decisions about whether or not to share their data. But you get a sick person in the family, and you're really willing to do a lot to prevent them being sick or at least them finding some treatment. So that's a very good point, that these run in families a lot. That's why we call them inherited disease. Sometimes they're new in a family, and finding them now means screening the rest of the family is much easier.
So maybe can I just add something real quick to that, which is, as part of the testing, the parents actually get clinical reports back themselves. So there are some genes that just get screened. They get pharmacogenomics information, which talks about their drug metabolism. So right off the bat, you have the whole family actually getting pertinent genetic information. And then to Shag's point, most of the benefit, or a large piece of the benefit that these families get, is understanding the etiology of this disease, understanding where it came from. And that leads to all sorts of family decisions, often reproductive health decisions, so that they're informed and they can make the right decision for their family.
Good deal. Let's actually continue to build on Shags's point with a final question, which is we've talked quite a bit about large scale benefits of what you talk about structural sustainability. In your stories, you talked about very personal things, about the kind of symptoms that people who might be dealing with a genomic condition might face. And in both of the stories, Ryan, you told, we talked about erratic behavior. Is there a preponderance of conditions that can be explained with several symptom categories that would allow people to maybe have on their radar, maybe this is a genetic issue?
You want me to tackle that one first, Sharon?
Yeah.
So I think, to Sharon's points about like how many people are out there with genetic disease, that's a huge number, that 250 million. And so you've got to imagine you probably know somebody with a genetic disease, or you know somebody who knows somebody with a genetic disease. When we look across all of these disorders, we think about roughly 6,000 to 7,000 of these rare genetic diseases. And we ask the question, what kind of unites all of them? Well, there's two things. One, there's something that's gone wrong in the genome. And the second thing is the vast majority of them have some sort of nervous system component to them. So we'll see ataxias or abnormal movement, epilepsy, developmental delay, intellectual disability. And so I would like to see where we're actually testing every single one of those patients, because we would argue they have a very high prior probability of a genetic disease.
Yeah, and I'd add to that, Rushton, that even when we say, oh, that person had breast cancer, we just heard from Shags, yeah, sometimes that's a genetic disease, a lot of times, probably most of the time. Or even things like, I just got off a very large phone call with all the NIH directors this morning about Alzheimer's, and how we start to parse that genetically, genomically, and the genes that influence it, why some people get it and some don't, and why one medication works and why another one doesn't. And so I think what we're seeing is that genomics, while it doesn't determine everything, and we can't say, oh, that's genetic, but just by looking at somebody, we can get a pretty good idea that the differences in how we respond, how we even express a disease, right? One person with arthritis expresses it one way, another expresses it another way, are all genetic. And a program like this is going to suss out lots and lots of things in an open space that we haven't been able to do before.
Well, thank you both for a powerful vision for what's possible, and I'm excited for us to be able to share this recording. All of our viewers, I hope you know that you are able to get into our YouTube channel and find all of these programs and to share them, and do so because you may know people who are capable of supporting the kind of work that Sharon is doing with Genetic Alliance and Ryan is doing with Illumina. To all of our viewers, a couple of things to wind us down before I hand it back to Sharon for the final word. And that is this: if you are a visiting Rotarian, let us know you were here. We'd like to be able to send you a little note that you can pass along to your club secretary if you're working to make up a mess at your own club, and leave us a note in the forum. And this goes for all of those who might be watching this video on our meeting page. It is our opportunity in an asynchronous club to be able to share ideas. And so the discuss forum is there for you to be able to comment upon both the program and any other element of the meeting that we share with you. You can respond to other people. It's a friendly and civil kind of conversation, and the kind of thing that we love seeing as we greet guests who spend time taking in the kinds of things that we find exciting and inspiring. With that, Sharon, I will hand it back to you for the final word. Thank you again for being with us.
Thank you so much. And as I look at the globe behind you, the map of the world, and also the Rotary symbol, I remember quite clearly that the Rotary Club of a tiny town in Massachusetts, Sharon, Mass, was one of the first to support me in my endeavor to actually change the world this way in 1994 and 95. So bravo to Rotarians. I'd also want to invite you all to come with Ryan and me into what I once in a while envision as this room with amazing toys in it. The technology's astounding, and it's all sitting here in this room. And it's really enough every night to bring me to tears that I know there's so many kids, particularly, and adults suffering, and they don't need to anymore because we have all of this ready to go. Got the systems down, we built the SOPs, we have our agile stuff in place, and our sprints are ready, and we just don't have the operations funding. And so I invite you to join us either by spreading the word, by making donations, making connections the way Rotarians always do. So thank you very, very much.
Thank you both. And for everyone, we will see you next week.